And the chair now recognizes the vice chair of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas's 14th district, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Christie, I'm going to come back to you for a couple of questions. Can you endure that?
I'll try.
Okay, we know you will. The lady from Virginia earlier talked about transmission lines and pipelines as if they were one and the same, should be treated the same, and all that kind of stuff. How do you think transmission and pipe, wires, if you want to call them that, and pipelines are different?
Well, pipelines are different in several ways. First of all, it was Congress, I think, made the decision back in World War II to give what was in the Federal Power Commission, the permitting authority, I think is a wartime measure. But another difference is a pipe, and we permitted those at FERC and did a lot of them. A pipeline is financed differently. A transmission line is going to be financed by consumers because it's going to go into something called rate base. It's a utility asset. And consumers are going to pay for it really from in RTOs, consumers pay for it from the minute it goes into the regional plan. They start paying. Even if it doesn't get built, and I can give you an example called the PATH project, which never got built, and $250 million was spent and charged to consumers in Virginia for a project that never got built. That doesn't happen with pipelines. Pipelines are financed by shippers, so the shipper pays for the pipeline. So it's really not a utility asset in that sense. A pipeline might serve a utility, like a local distribution company, which is a utility, a state-regulated utility. But the pipeline itself is going to be paid for by shippers who sign contracts called precedent agreements, and at FERC, we don't approve a pipeline unless there's sufficient market demand in the form of precedent agreements to pay for the pipeline. But a transmission line, consumers are going to pay from the second it goes into a regional plan.
Right, that's a good analogy. People, I want to come back to you. People often tout the interregional transfer capacity report from NERC as evidence of the benefits of interregional transmission. Since you were chair of FERC at the time, you may have a different opinion. You know what I'm talking about. What was the conclusion of the report, and what should Congress take away from that report's findings?
Well, I reported the preliminary findings from NERC last August when I was chair. What NERC said was, yes, we need interregional transmission. I think there's no disagreement on that. I fully agree with it. We benefited during Hurricane Uri, Winter Storm Uri, from interregional transfers. The FERC point was, we need interregional transmission, but there's no basis for an ex-ante mandate plucked out of the air where you say, okay, I think there's a Senate bill that said 15% of the load in 2 regions, you had to build transmission to that degree. That's going to spend a lot of money on transmission that hasn't passed a cost-benefit test. We need interregional transmission. What NERC's point was, we need interregional transmission. It needs to be done on an individual basis where the regions come up with individual fact-finding that supports the individual project, which, by the way, is the way all utility assets ought to be built if you want least cost, pro-consumer results.
Yeah, leave it to the states, I think I hear you saying. And boy, I tell you, we experienced that February of 2021 Winter Storm Uri in Texas. Fortunately, ERCOT was, on track with things. So, Ms. Clark, I'm going to come back to you for just a minute. Do you kind of agree with his assessment that pipelines and electrical lines are different, or do you have a different perspective?
No, Congressman, thank you for the question. Have exactly the same perspective and would have answered that portion of it the same way that Chair Christie did. I would add a couple of other things to it where I think there's differentiation between pipelines and transmission lines. With pipelines, there was a decision made at the national level that, look, there is one source area that you're attempting to collect the gas from to deliver to one demand area. So you have to connect it via a pipeline, and there's not a lot of other decisions to be made in that regard, in addition to the fact that it's actually the shippers paying it as opposed to sort of everyone in a rate base. The transmission is totally different. There are lots of different ways that you can deliver power. You can have generation closer to load. You can build a certain type of transmission in one place or another. It's a much more dynamic process. It doesn't lend itself to federalization in the same way.
And it's good for the ratepayers. Would you agree with that, Mr. Howard?
I would agree.
Mr. Gramlich?
I think there's a federal role for transmission and a grid that is a single machine across dozens of states.
Mr. Skelly?
I think we heard from other witnesses that interregional transmission is necessary and helpful, but so we need to come up with mechanisms to make it happen.
Mr. Reichard?
I agree.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.